Hello and welcome back to another episode of Whiskey Uncorked. Today we're going to be starting out on a bit of an adventure. See, we are going to be doing a number of reviews for 18-year-old single malt Scotch whiskies. Now obviously, like we usually do on these Monday episodes, I'll be getting into some of the deeper details after the review, but just to give you a little bit of an incentive to stick around, the reason for deciding to do this series of 18-year-old single malts is basically that I feel like 18-year-old Scotch whiskies are kind of this inflection point for Scotch whiskey in the current day. Now, we all know that prices have been increasing pretty much across the board. But what we've seen is that price increases at the lower end of things tend to be a little bit more gradual and maybe primarily just following the increase in inflation over the last couple of years. However, around 15 to 18 years old, the price really seems to start ramping up, and then once you hit 18, it just seems to go up from there. And a lot of whiskeys that are above 20 years old have almost strictly become unobtainable for most people. Now, this wasn't always the case. There was a time when 15 to 18-year-old Scotch whiskies, although maybe your shelf wasn't going to be full of them, you could at least obtain one if you really wanted one, either by, saving some money up, waiting a few months, cutting back on maybe some of your 10 or 12-year-old purchases, that sort of thing. However, nowadays, either they are just completely out of reach in terms of their price point, or they're just really difficult to justify for a lot of people. And this is really sad because 18 years old, at least for me, is where things really start to take off in terms of that flavor journey and just overall excitement around Scotch whiskey to begin with. Now, you would think for most people this probably has caused them to stop buying 18-year-old whiskeys. However, for me, I have kind of found it to actually be a little bit of the opposite. You see, there's this thing that we all know probably if you're a big-time whiskey lover, FOMO, right? The fear of missing out. And we all probably experience this at various times in our journey around certain bottles, certain distilleries, and this causes us to maybe exceed our budget or overpay for a particular bottle, and we just basically will do anything that we can to get the latest and greatest thing. Now, most of the time, this is because, frankly, we don't want to be left out of the conversation. We don't want to miss out on something from one of our favorite distilleries. We want to be able to join in on the groups online or in person and be able to converse about the latest and greatest release from one of the best distilleries in the world. Now, for me, that's not necessarily the type of FOMO that I've been experiencing. And to try to sum that up briefly, this is the cheapest it's ever going to be, so I better get one now. So I've chosen Ancnoc 18-year-old to kick off this series of reviews. And the reason why I did that is because this is actually the first bottle that I kind of experienced this, I better get it now, or maybe I'll never be able to afford it sort of feeling. Even though I bought this a couple years ago. But if you're interested in hearing me talk about that experience and just generally my recent experience with 18-year-old whiskeys and what I think of some of the price points and things that they're being released at, stick around after the review. But without further ado, let's review Ancnoc 18. So before we do some tasting notes, let's talk about the bottle and Ancnoc in general for just a minute. So Ancnoc is not actually the name of the distillery, if you weren't aware. It's actually the Knockdhu Distillery, and it's had to do with basically, there was some confusion over Knockdhu Distillery and the Knockdhu Distillery, and Knockdhu decided to just start selling their whiskey under the Ancnoc banner. But as I mentioned, this bottle is 18 years old. It is 46% ABV. It says right on the label, non-chill filtered and natural color. And Ancnoc is owned by Inverhouse. That is the umbrella organization that owns Knockdhu, as well as Ball Blair, Speyburn, and Old Pulteney. So we're going to talk about price a little bit more later, but I bought this bottle back in 2022, or in fact, I was gifted it, but I know how much it costs. It was $120 plus tax. Currently, that's up to about $150 plus tax. Alright, let's get into some nosing notes here. So you're immediately hit with a florality. It's a very dense floralness. It's like walking into a flower shop. It is fairly thick and it's dense in its florality. And at first, I wasn't sure if that was something I really loved. Now, luckily, at least for me, this settles down into a little bit more of a typical sherry nose, or at least typically sherry influenced nose, because the maltiness has not been lost. You still get a good dose of that Speyside whiskey, and a lot of fruitiness comes out alongside that barley, and I'm primarily getting cherries and mangoes there. So being a Speyside whiskey, I think this is probably relatively traditional, but with a little bit of age, right? You could almost call this pretty, but there's enough density there in the nose where you know you're going to be in for a fairly flavorful experience on the palate. Yeah, there's certainly a touch of nuttiness, there's sherry notes, but they are well integrated and nothing is jumping out as being the loudest one in the room. And occasionally I can pick up something that kind of reminds me of a smokiness. Now obviously this is not peated at all, and you don't get any peat, but there is almost maybe a smokiness that's either coming from maybe some dirty sherry type notes or maybe some barrel char, but every once in a while I get like a little puff of smokiness. It almost borderlines on a type of waxiness. Certainly not, we're not talking Clynelish or even Longmorn or anything like that, but this does come out a little bit more on the palate. Speaking of, let's take a sip. Cheers. So, similar to the nose, up front you get that florality. But it tastes pretty good. It's sweet. And then as you swallow it, those sherry notes kind of start to pick up, and you get the fruitiness, that cherry and mango still there. And then you get some beeswax, and then towards the finish you start to get some dried cranberries, and similar to the nose, that maltiness is able to keep up with everything else that's going on. All right, let's do a second sip. Again, you almost get some of that barrel char more on the finish. Almost has a smoky flavor to it, but if you don't like peat, don't worry about it. You're not going to get any of that. This is more akin to like when you find a bourbon that's a little smoky. But on the finish is good. There's some sweet honey that remains. You can still pick up some of that fruitiness, but it really settles into an oakiness and some dry citrus pith. I'd probably go with like a lemon and orange, but overall you're kind of getting some dry, slightly bitter notes that almost reminds me of like some lingering American West Coast IPA, at least on the finish. So in addition to some of that like fruity, dry, citrusy quality that an IPA has, you're getting a little bit of bitterness, a little bit of dryness, and some resinous qualities as well. So there's very little to complain about when it comes to this bottle of whiskey. Now, I did buy this in 2020, so this is a fairly old batch. Now it's 2024. And I know a lot of the recent batches are darker in color. This one is still fairly light, comparatively at least. But generally what I've heard is the flavor isn't necessarily dramatically different. But if you are looking for something a little bit more lightly sherried, You'll have to look for some more recent reviews to see how those compare. So yeah, the nose, I love the nose. It's almost pretty, but it's dense, and there's some heaviness and there's some complex notes in there. On the palate, you are getting a pretty even but morphing and layered experience. And the finish is pleasant as well, if not maybe slightly unusual, at least for me, although I was a big IPA drinker, so it was a welcome experience. Alright, so as far as the score goes, I'm going to go with an 8 out of 10, excellent on this one. Now, this isn't necessarily my favorite whiskey I've ever had, but I think if I'm going to judge this for what it is, this is an extremely well balanced, extremely flavorful, and extremely enjoyable Scotch malt whiskey. Its complexities are subtle but present, and you can read into this one all day. You can sit and slowly sip this thing and find new things every time you take a sip. As far as Speyside whiskey goes, I haven't drank a ton of them, particularly official bottlings. I mean, there are certainly quite a few that I've had, but they have been more of the style of like Craig Ellicky, for example. So as far as traditional Speysiders go, this is up there with some of my favorites. And even though I wouldn't consider this my go-to style, this bottle is certainly making me reconsider that. Alright, so 8 out of 10, excellent. In terms of value, this being $150 now, and this is going to lead into this larger conversation, but this is feeling still like a pretty solid deal. With many 18-year-old single malts reaching that kind of $200 range, $150 isn't that bad. I just bought a Tomatin 18, and again, I'll get into a little bit more as to why I bought that alongside a few others. But the Tomatin 18, I picked that up for $130, so this is maybe a little bit above that, but generally speaking, the perception of Ancnoc is probably that it's a slightly higher quality. Now you'll have to wait for my review of Tomatin 18 to see if that's what I believe, but $130, $150, this is starting to feel like that solid range in price for 18-year-old single malts. So this is a pretty solid value, I would say. It's pretty fair. $150 US plus tax, so you're probably going to be paying in the range of about $160 plus or minus, maybe depending on where you live. This is kind of where I think we should be at least expecting these bottles to be landing in 2024. Now you may be saying, screw that, $150 for an 18-year-old Scotch whiskey, I'm never going to pay that. And that's obviously your prerogative, as yes, the prices on 18-year-old whiskeys, as I mentioned earlier, is continuing to basically skyrocket. But yes, probably about 3.5 years ago, I was able to get this bottle for $120, which seems to be about $30 less than what I can find it for now. Although depending on where you live, you may be able to find this bottle a little bit closer to that $120 price point. So why did I choose to do this one first, and why did I kick off this 18-year-old series to begin with? Well, as I mentioned, that I've been experiencing this, what I consider to be a type of FOMO, right? It's talked about a lot, both in the bourbon communities and Scotch communities, but just this idea that, like, I have to get that. I don't want to be left out in the cold. I want to be a part of the conversation. Everyone else is talking about it, and I need to participate in this as well. And although that's not necessarily what I've been feeling when it comes particularly to 18-year-old whiskeys, but as I mentioned, the price on these things just seems to continue to go up. I think I mentioned in my Bunnahabhain review, my Bunnahabhain 12 review, that Bunnahabhain 18 in the United States is basically $400 a bottle now. Now, this isn't due to the distillery, as far as I can tell. As it's still an affordable bottle, relatively speaking. It's probably cheaper than this in the UK, or at least about the same price point as this in the UK, although I haven't looked to see what this bottle in particular is selling for over there quite yet. I'll have it in the graphic. I'm sure you probably already saw it. But basically, Bunnahabhain 18, if you're looking to buy one in the States, is largely unobtainable. It's starting to approach Dalmore pricing and even Macallan pricing to some degree, here in the States at least. Meanwhile, you have bottles like the Glendronach 18, which at one time was at least a somewhat reasonable price point, again sitting around the price point of this Ancnoc 18, maybe a little bit more, but now that is well over $200 a bottle plus tax. You have the new Bruichladdich 18 coming out at as low as $175, but it seems like $190 is about the average. Again, of course, that's plus sales tax. And the Port Charlotte 18 came out at an even $200 plus tax. So it seems like these Scotch whiskeys that are 18 years old are official bottlings, non-chill filter, natural color, 46 to 50% ABV in the case of the Bruichladdich releases, seem to be settling around that $200 price point, plus or minus $20. Again, in the UK, you may find that that's cheaper than you can get on some of them, or maybe it's slightly more expensive. Generally, that 15 to 18-year-old range, where we seem to be fairly even, with a difference of $10 to $15 one way or the other. But why did I buy this bottle of Ancnoc, or why did I choose this as my Christmas present back in 2020? Well, see, I had just watched a video that I'm pretty sure was from Ralphie, and he was reviewing or discussing one of the more recent Ball Blair releases, as they had just done their rebranding and they had ditched their normal vintage statement, 1999, 2000, whatever, and had moved to the more traditional age statement releases. And at that time, the consensus, or the general consensus, was the prices had went way up from what they were before, and that there was a pretty noticeable decrease in quality. Now, obviously, that quality discussion is completely subjective. You may disagree with that. But one of the other things that he said, and I'm pretty sure it was a Ralphie video. It could have been someone else, but at that time, I don't think I was watching quite the breadth of people. And so I'm pretty sure this was Ralphie. But he essentially said that, Inverhouse being the owners of Ball Blair, which was what he was talking about, and also the owners of Ancnoc, that he really hoped that they didn't treat Ancnoc like they were doing with Ball Blair, and either change the formula or significantly raise prices. So when I was picking out my Christmas present, because obviously my girlfriend doesn't know what to buy, so she took me to the store, and I don't remember, it was probably for Christmas or my birthday or both, I can't remember. But I'm looking at the shelf and I saw this bottle of Ancnoc 18 and immediately thought back to this video that I had recently seen, and I thought, well, I better get one now in case they did treat this like Ball Blair. And so this was the bottle that I chose for my gift that year. And again, $120. Now, it being $150 now, that doesn't seem like absurd to me. In the, like I said, 3.5 to 4 years since then, obviously everything's went up to some degree, and it going up, $30 is somewhere in the 25% ish price increase over 4 years. That's unfortunate, but that seems to track across almost all of the Scotch whiskey industry. If anything, this is, as I mentioned before, kind of, a pretty solid value. It's not cheap by any stretch of the imagination, but if you're looking at the entire range of 18-year-olds, at least here in the States, you're not going to find too many that are significantly cheaper than this. Again, there's some in that $130 range, and then you kind of get down to like the Glen Murray, which I just picked up for $90, and then the Speyburn 18 is in and around $100 as well, I believe. So this was really the first time that I felt this other type of FOMO, like I better buy it now because this is the cheapest it will ever be. And that's true. That's a true statement. This bottle will never cost $120 again. Even if there's a whiskey crash, right? That brands hate lowering prices. All they do is they just stop raising them. And that's kind of the best that we can hope for. And we've actually kind of seen a few of these brands that at one time, and Ball Blair is a decent example of this, where the price at one time seemed like it was too high, but they've stayed relatively still in their pricing, and everything else has kind of been catching up to it. And suddenly, Ball Blair is getting a little bit more conversation lately. A, because they are not this outlier in price, and B, there's some buzz that maybe the quality's starting to improve as well. Little did I know that this feeling of I better get it now, it'll never be cheaper, was going to come back and be a pretty significant motivating factor in some of my whiskey purchases. And this has largely landed in that 18-year-old single malt space in the Scotch whiskey industry. As I mentioned, there's been the new Bruichladdich 18, which was something I have been waiting for a very long time. The Port Charlotte 18 in a similar vein, and that one has been getting great reviews as well. I haven't had the Port Charlotte yet, although I do have a bottle. It's just in Wisconsin, and I've got to get it to California so I can talk about it on camera. But these are coming out around $200 plus tax. I know the Arran 18 has been temporarily discontinued, which I just found out. I had the opportunity to get a bottle, I think, a couple weeks ago, but that was also $200, and I passed on it. Then to find out that it's now out of stock at that website, and it might not be back for a little while. But as I mentioned, I also went and I got a Bunnahabhain 18. I ordered that from overseas because here they're just getting too expensive, and I went and I grabbed, as I mentioned, a Tomatin 18 and a Glenmurray 18 for $130 and $90 respectively. As I mentioned, you kind of have some more luxury brands. You have like the Knockdhu and Glendronach, and just kind of shooting up to that Dalmore and Macallan sort of, I don't even want to call it a category. It's something else at this point. But for their 18-year-olds, you're paying probably about $400 minimum, depending on which version you get. So yeah, and as I mentioned, all of those prices that I'm seeing these things on the shelf for today, that is going to be the lowest price I probably ever see for them. And the reality is, it doesn't appear at this point that retail prices are going to slow down a whole lot. We can kind of hope that they plateau at some point and they stop going up, and maybe just let all of us kind of catch up over the years to the point where maybe they start to become affordable again. But for me, I kind of said, screw it, I'm not missing out on all of these things. And over the last few months, last 6 months or so, I've begun picking up a lot more of these 18-year-old releases. And it's FOMO. It's just not that immediate brand new release FOMO. These are things that have been sitting on the shelf mostly for a long time and have been regular releases for a long time, but they seem to be getting to the point where I'm just no longer going to be able to justify paying that price, even if I could technically afford them. But as I've mentioned on this channel before, I love Scotch whiskey, and in my mind, I want to try everything. I want to fill in as many gaps as I can, and that creates some challenges when things start getting really, really expensive. And when you start talking about that $250 point, even once in a while, that starts to become difficult, particularly when you're talking about something that is generally available and sitting on the shelf all the time and isn't particularly rare or unique. So anyways, that's what spurred me on to do this series. I may not review an 18-year-old single malt every single week. I might break it up here and there. But generally, I think this is probably a really kind of interesting, if not maybe slightly depressing conversation point around the Scotch whiskey industry. Especially when you know that it doesn't necessarily cost these companies that much more to age whiskey, right? I mentioned a Glenmurray 18 is $90 here in the States, and that is 46% ABV. And so comparing that to some of these releases that are hitting the $200 mark, that Glenmurray whiskey sat in the same type of cask, is made from the same ingredients, sat in a fairly similar climate, being just in Scotland, and it's half the price of a lot of these other whiskeys. So obviously these distilleries, or their owners at the very least, will try to convince you that 18-year-old whiskey is just super, super rare and it evaporates in the air and the angels share and this and that. But that's all kind of BS. When you have distilleries that can sell 18-year-old single malt scotch, and they are good single malt scotches, maybe not the best or the most complex, but from an ingredient standpoint and a maintenance standpoint, cost of production isn't that much more for the Arrans of the world or the Bruichladdich of the world or the Glendronachs of the world, where they need to charge $200 plus and another distillery is releasing pretty solid whiskey that's, and maybe in some people's opinion, as good or better, than some of these other releases, and charge twice as much. These distilleries have been making whiskey for a long time, and yes, maybe some of their older stocks have been depleted because they were adding it to maybe a lower age stated vatting, a la Glendronach, and I'm sure other distilleries were doing this in order to up the quality of their lower age stated products to encourage people to buy their whiskey. And then when it got to the point where they didn't need any additional encouragement, they realized that they had to take that older stock out because they either didn't have any left, or they couldn't justify doing it because they can sell it for a higher price point, which saw the decrease in quality of a lot of 10, 12, and even 15-year-old age-stated scotches, at least according to the enthusiasts. So now we're being told that whiskey is super rare and it's super precious, and that's not really our fault one way or the other. It wasn't that expensive before. It doesn't cost, obviously it costs more to make whiskey now, but once the whiskey is made, there's not a whole lot of additional costs going into just aging whiskey, particularly when you're aging in dunnage style warehouses that aren't climate controlled. And being that cost is spread out across every cask in the warehouse, the amount it costs to actually age a barrel of whiskey for a year can't possibly be that much. And even if you do consider the angel share in Scotland is pretty low comparatively to other places around the world, particularly, let's say, in bourbon country. So you end up in this situation where we as the consumers are essentially being gaslit into thinking that 18-year-old Scotch whiskey is so precious and it's so difficult to make and it takes so much patience, etc., 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 when they were dumping it into 12-year-old whiskey just a few years ago. The problem is that, and I'm a perfect example of this, people keep buying it. I get excited about a Bruichladdich release because it's one of my favorite distilleries, and in a way I've been pounding my fist on the table for years, luckily not in front of a camera, asking like, where is the older Bruichladdich? And when they finally released it, I almost felt like I had no choice. I had to buy it. So I'll probably be reviewing that bottle pretty soon, as early as next week. But I think that's probably enough ranting today. Again, this is going to be a series, and I'll be discussing some other factors here in terms of what we choose to buy, why I've chosen to pick certain things up. And yeah, a lot of it is just going to be a bit of selfishness on my part because I don't want to encourage this, but at the same time I'm being put in a really difficult position, particularly with some of these distilleries, and I'm releasing things that I do legitimately really, really want. Hence me going and getting maybe some of the more affordable options, and now I can educate myself on whether or not it's actually worth it to spend this extra money. But I think that's it for today. Thank you again, everyone, for tuning in. Please leave a like, subscribe, and if you're feeling really generous, leave a comment. Let me know if you're enjoying these longer episodes and what you think about the increases in price. Do you find that kind of content engaging? I didn't really want price to be this constant topic on my channel, and I've tried to keep it kind of segmented into the value proposition parts of my reviews, but it's an unavoidable fact about modern day whiskey enthusiasm and being a whiskey lover. Like, price is this inescapable conversation, and it's going to have to be addressed here and there, even though it is the thief of joy, in my particular opinion. Talking about price isn't fun. It's not romantic, it's not sexy, it's none of those things. I prefer to talk about how good the whiskey is, but now might be the time for me to broach this subject a little bit more in depth and kind of get it out of the way. But until next week, thank you again for watching. Cheers.